of the case reports, especially by Senelli and Alzamora, they have demonstrated the presence of virus in the placental tissues, indicating the possibility of a vertical transmission. Now, most of these reports relate to mothers being infected in the third trimester. At present, we don't have much information or data about the impact of maternal COVID-19 infection in the first and the second trimester, and also the incidence of fetal losses, congenital defect, and the possible teratogenicity is yet to be fully explored. There's an excellent seminal study by the National Neonatology Forum presented in the form of a COVID-19 registry. The data alludes to from April 2020 to March 21. 1,733 mother-infant pairs were studied in 20 hospitals across the country. 95% of these were public sector hospitals like All Institute and PGI Chandigarh. 1,589 were intramural in-house deliveries, and 122 children were extramural, coming from outside. 68% was the C-section rate remains. Now, after the intramural, the perinatal transmission was noticed in 8%. This was transmission occurring within first 72 hours of life. Beyond 72 hours of life, which are labeled as horizontal transmission, it occurred in 1.5%. Very remarkably, the risk of transmission was not affected by the mode of delivery, whether it was the vaginal route or by the cesarean section. Similarly, the type of feeding did not matter as far as the risk of transmission was concerned. Surprisingly, rooming-in led to a marginal increase in the risk of acquiring infection. We'll talk about this a little later. Now, the 1,300 newborns that they tested, 143 were positive. Now, this gives you a rate of 10.8%. It is quite similar to some of the British studies, although many Indian studies have reported higher figures. A very crucial point was that 21% of the intramural positive newborns were symptomatic. Now, 21% is a fairly high figure. An exceedingly important point also was that 21% of these babies were delivered prematurely. And this indicates a fairly high risk of premature labor in COVID positive mother. And this also comes to confound the results when we talk about the overall impact of the neonatal COVID on the newborn babies. Very remarkable was the risk which was seen in the COVID positive newborns. The COVID positive newborns were 5 times more likely to be symptomatic. They were twice more likely to need resuscitation. There was a greater risk of sepsis and septic shock. Respiratory support was needed much more often. They more likely to need surfactant, steroids, and inotropes, and the radiological abnormalities were there. Now, one must remember at this point that 20% of these babies were premature babies. So this was a confounding factor in the analysis. But definitely the babies were COVID positive at a greater risk. But the good thing was that the mortality between the COVID positive newborns and the COVID negative newborns was not very significantly different. Now, how to diagnose neonatal COVID-19? Now, this can be very challenging because this testing sensitivity depends on the sensitivity of the test. It also depends on the appropriate timing and the accurate technique of sample collection. There are 2 categories of newborns. Now, if there is a history of exposure to a COVID-19 positive adult, or the mother has had COVID within 14 days before birth, or there is a history of postnatal contact with a COVID positive person, which might be a mother, which might be a caregiver, or might be a healthcare person. Now, even if there's no history of exposure, do we still test for the COVID-19? Yes. If there's a presence of pneumonia, or if there is a severe acute respiratory illness needing hospitalization, having its onset after 48 to 72 hours of age, you again must test for the neonatal COVID-19. And if there's no other significant explanation consistent with the diagnosis of this pneumonia or the severe acute respiratory infection. Which is the right time to test for the neonatal COVID? Now, there's a slight controversy at this point. We are going by the NNF guidelines. They say that a baby should be tested at birth if mother has COVID-19. If there is postnatal exposure, as soon as the history of contact with a COVID positive person is known, or if the sample is not collected at birth due to some logistic reason, you must collect the sample as soon as possible. Now, the first line that the baby should be tested at birth if the mother has COVID-19. Now, what they mean by at birth is in the COVID-19 registry, they employed the time of 12 hours. And their argument was that at that time, there's the least risk of it being contaminated by the maternal vaginal secretions or the maternal secretion. So that excludes that possibility. So the best time would be at around 12 hours of age. As far as the CDC guidelines are concerned, CDC recommends that babies should be tested at 24 hours. And if they are negative at that time, you should again test at 48 hours. But the Indian guidelines, especially the NNF guidelines at the moment, suggest that baby should be tested if the mother is COVID-19 positive at 12 hours of age. But if the postnatal exposure occurs, you must test as soon as the history is known. Suppose the first test is negative. When should you repeat the test? Now, if the index of suspicion is very high, then the test should be repeated after 24 to 48 hours. But if the index of suspicion is relatively low, the test should be repeated after about 5 to 10 or 14 days. But very important is to remember that if there are appearances of new symptoms like respiratory distress, the baby should be tested again immediately. So repeat testing depends on the context that you're talking about. If the first test is negative, the baby seems to be okay, you can repeat the test after 5 to 14 days. But if the new symptoms like respiratory distress or other such problems appear, you must again test the baby immediately to confirm the presence of neonatal COVID-19. There is a fair amount of information now available about the COVID-19 infection. In the beginning of the pandemic, the moment the baby's mother was detected to be COVID positive, the babies were separated from their mothers for 14 days. They were deprived of the mother's feed. They were kept isolated. But that philosophy has changed as we acquire new information about the behavior of the virus. And today we know that neonatal COVID-19 infection can be an early onset infection, which presents between 2 to 7 days after birth. It can be a late onset infection, which can present between 5 to 7 days after birth, or sometimes, although very rarely, it might present as a multi-system inflammatory syndrome in newborns. But a very remarkable point which I like to highlight at this point is that as compared to older children, where, as Dr. Niranjan very rightly pointed out, the incidence of severe disease is much less, might be 2 to 3%. But many studies have demonstrated that neonates, especially the symptomatic neonates, have much more severe illness. In some studies, this might be to the tune of 12%. Now, this is a very significant figure because if a newborn has a symptomatic COVID-19 infection, one should be very alert to the possibility of him developing a much more severe illness, which might be to the tune of 10 to 12%. The early onset neonatal COVID is more likely to be caused by perinatal transmission, although it may be intrapartum transmission, more commonly occurring immediately after the birth. As we all know that most of newborns are asymptomatic, but some of them have mild symptoms like rhinorrhea, like fever, which might be sometimes high. Very occasionally, they might have a sporadic cough, although cough is not a common symptom of the neonatal COVID. Moderate to severe symptoms may eventually develop in some children, which might be in the form of a mild to moderate respiratory distress, poor feeding, lethargy, vomiting. Diarrhea might occur in 30%. Cyanosis without respiratory distress might be there. And some unfortunate babies might progress to multi-organ dysfunction. Late onset neonatal COVID, on the other hand, is much more common. And majority of these babies are diagnosed 5 to 7 days after birth. Of course, this is because of postnatal transmission. And here, the exposure of the newborn baby to the maternal respiratory secretions likely to be the most common etiology, or he might be exposed to infected healthcare personnel or household contacts. These two play a major role in the acquisition of the late onset neonatal COVID. Now, the general history is in this situation that these newborns are negative for RT-PCR at 24 to 48 hours. They are discharged. And then after a few days, they are readmitted with symptoms suggestive of COVID-19, possibly acquiring the infection at home from the mother who was not following the respiratory precautions or from the other persons. They frequently present with mild respiratory symptoms like, and also may have apnea, vomiting, and lethargy. Neonatal multi-system inflammatory syndrome is an extremely rare situation. Very few cases have been reported, although of late, especially with the second wave, many more cases are being seen. I've been talking to some of our friends here, and let us remember that the data that the NNF has presented related to first wave and its aftermath. The new data they are likely to release very soon of the second wave, and here there might be many more cases of the multi-system inflammatory syndrome, even in the neonates. The few cases that have been reported, there was a 33-week newborn who presented with a pericardial infusion. There was another baby who was 49 days old at the time of diagnosis, but he was exposed at the age of 15 days and presented with very severe GI symptoms. There was another 26-week newborn who developed cardiovascular collapse and myocarditis. And a very interesting case was the last one, which was a 4-day-old baby who presented with PPHN. Now, this baby's mother was COVID negative, but both mother and the baby had IgG and IgM against the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And this baby had a multi-system involvement, which included vasculitic rash, NEC-like illness, and on X-ray, he had bilateral ground glass opacities. Now, here it was assumed that transplacental exposure to the maternal IgG could have been the contributor to the cytokine storm in this newborn baby. So this is an extremely rare situation, but there are cases being reported. Very commonly in the second wave have been seen the COVID-19 pneumonia. The interesting thing is there's a significant overlap with the other perinatal respiratory disorders. So you have to be careful when you're making a diagnosis of a COVID-19 pneumonia, because many of the other conditions present with similar symptomatology. Another confounding factor is that at the moment, we have very limited information about drug handling by the newborn and the preterm babies, and the cutoff for the laboratory markers of the inflammation are very poorly defined. So very difficult to use these markers for a clear-cut diagnosis. And since the absolute number of the neonates with the late onset infection have increased in the second wave, the good thing is that the majority have only mild disease and improve with nasal prongs oxygen only. The general management is quite similar to the older children, as Dr. Niranjan discussed in the guidelines for the older children. This is the representation, especially the CT scan, where you can see there's a subpleural pneumonia setting and also the ground glass haziness in the CT scan. The other common laboratory and radiological findings, the babies might have leukocytosis, lymphopenia, thrombocytopenia, transaminases might be elevated. In some situations, the coagulation abnormalities are there. Some of the babies might land up with DIC. The cytokine levels, especially IL-6 and IL-10, are raised. Their non-specific inflammatory markers are also elevated. The exochest may be normal, but may also show ground glass opacities and bilateral lung infiltrate, which are suggestive of a COVID-19 pneumonia. Now to the management. The antenatal management is not in our domain, but let's remember that pregnancy is a partially immunocompromised state. And it has been observed that the pregnant women with COVID-19 are more likely to be admitted to an ICU. The mortality is also higher among pregnant women who are infected with COVID-19. And in some of these women, the surgery has to be done, the C-section had to be done in the ICU settings. There's a case report of a woman who was operated while she was on ECMO. So one has to be careful in the antenatal period when these mothers are suffering from the COVID-19. Antenatal steroids are recommended because they have proven benefits on neonatal mortality and morbidity. Magnesium sulfate for neuroprotection has also been decided on a case-to-case basis. Very important from the pediatrician and the neonatologist point of view is the management of the delivery room. The mode of delivery and the anesthesia. This will be as per the discretion of the obstetric and the anesthesia teams, irrespective of the COVID-19 status. The delivery should be preferably in a setup which is equipped for the critical care handling of the mother as well as of the baby. It should be in a negative pressure room if it is possible. A very important point is that the location of the neonatal resuscitation should be such that the risk of infection transmission is the least. Ideally, it should be an adjacent room to the delivery room, but if it has to be done in the same room, then it has to be done at a distance of 6 feet. There should be some physical barrier between the mother and the baby, like a plastic curtain might be there. Least number of staff should be permitted in the delivery room. They should don the proper personal protection equipment, and the mother should be wearing a triple layer mask. One should be very careful if there are aerosol generating procedure to be undertaken in the delivery room. Now, these aerosol generating procedures are the TPs and mask ventilation, bag and mask ventilation, intubation, suctioning, high flow oxygen therapy, especially if more than 2 liters per minute, CPAP, and mechanical ventilation. Now, during bag and mask ventilation, it is preferable that a 2% technique is used as compared to a 1% technique. As you can see in this figure, that the two people, one is holding the mask to make sure there's a perfect seal and no leakage of the air, and the second person is doing the bagging. So this 2% technique is desirable when you're doing intubation or you are doing bag and mask ventilation in such a situation. Some people are using video laryngoscopy to reduce the risk to the clinician during the intubation. And the recommendation is that intubation should be done by the senior most and the most competent person present there, so that it can be done very rapidly without any risk to the baby and also without any risk to the people who are there. An important thing is to transfer the baby to the NICU from the delivery room in a closed incubator and along a kind of green corridor, which is a pre-decided route, so that minimal exposure of the baby and the staff to the aerosol or to the infectious secretions. So this is also a very important part of the management. Other important aspect of neonatal resuscitation in the COVID-19 situation is that this should be a standard procedure according to the recommendation of the NNF. Very important thing is that the routine newborn care and the initial steps of resuscitation do not generate aerosol, and they can be done as per the standard recommendation. But if you have to do suction of the airway, this is an aerosol generating procedure, and this should not be performed routinely as we've been doing otherwise for clear or even for meconium-stained amniotic fluid. Endotracheal intubation and installation of drugs are also drugs like surfactant or epinephrine. They're also aerosol generating procedures, and they should be performed with full precautions. And for IV installation, you can do umbilical venous catheterization, which is the preferred mode in such a situation. Where do you keep the baby? Once you have done your bit in the delivery room, you have to shift him to the NICU or to the ward. Now, this depends on how stable the baby is and how sick the mother is. If the baby is stable, there can be two possibilities. He might be COVID suspect or he might be COVID positive. Now, this depends on the mother's situation. If the mother is not sick, if she's otherwise okay, you can shift the mother to the postnatal COVID ward, and you can have rooming in of the baby with the mother, and the mother can breastfeed by taking all the precautions. But if the mother is sick, for this stable baby, you shift him to the well baby COVID ward, and you can give him either EVM or a formula feeding. The other possibility is that the baby is sick or his gestational age is less than 34 weeks. Now here the situation depends on whether the baby is COVID suspect or whether the baby is COVID positive. Now if the baby is COVID suspect, he should be shifted to the COVID suspect area of the NICU. And if he's COVID positive, he should be shifted to the COVID positive area of the NICU. Now, ideally, an NICU should have these two areas, one for the COVID suspect babies, and the other should be for the COVID positive baby. But this might not be feasible everywhere. Now, in such a situation, what is more important is to keep the gap between the babies and the incubators of at least 6 feet or 2 meters. So this situation depends on the nature of the mother's status and also of the baby's status and his gestational age. In the management of the NICU, baby should be cared in an incubator in a separate room, preferably where there should be negative room pressure. If you can't ensure room with a negative pressure, then you can use exhaust fans to drive the inner air out. If that is not available, you can keep the baby in a closed incubator, and the babies should be 6 feet apart. Central air conditioning should be avoided. If you have to keep an air conditioned room, there should be at least 12 air exchanges per hour, and there should be filtering of the exhaust air. Another important aspect is that one can use an aerosol box during intubation if available. If you need to intubate the baby either in the delivery room or in the NICU, one can use a box like this, which is made of plexiglass or clear plastic. And here there's 2 portholes for the insertion of the hands. And here you can intubate the baby, ensuring least exposure to your own self or to the other staff present in the delivery room or in the NICU. So these plexiglass boxes are sometimes available and they can be used Some people also use plastic curtains in such a situation, which are also quite helpful. The area providing respiratory support should have negative air pressure. The closed ET suction circuit should be used with a hydrophobic filter at the exhalation port. Of the two modalities, CPAP and HFNC, CPAP should be preferred because there is a significant evidence that there is dispersion of the exhaled air with the HFNC. Whenever possible, one should use bacterial or viral filters when there is manual ventilation to reduce the dispersion of the air. But this may not be very easily available. But such filters, one must remember, should be avoided for extremely low birth weight because in them, this may lead to iatrogenic hypercapnia and might lead to IVH. Filters also reduce the efficiency of the procedure. The specific treatment is not recommended at the moment. Only sometimes on anecdotal basis, the drugs have been tried. So the treatment of the neonatal COVID is primarily symptomatic and supportive. Specific anti-COVID drugs are not recommended even in the symptomatic newborns. Even adjunctive therapy like systemic corticosteroids or IVIG or convalescent plasma are not recommended in suspected or confirmed newborns. Although some of the hospitals have been using IVIG or even convalescent plasma. Some of these cases have been noticed in the neonatal registry by the NNF. But in desperate situation, people have been trying corticosteroids. NNF is likely to introduce its new guideline very soon, and it seems they're likely to recommend the judicious use of corticosteroid in desperate situations. Some people have used remdesivir in newborn babies in desperate situations. There's a case report of a 22-day-old baby with severe late onset COVID. He tolerated the treatment very well and improved. There was another 4-day-old baby who was deteriorating and then was given remdesivir along with Dexona and convalescent plasma. He needed ventilation till day 13 of life and eventually improved. Some of these drugs may be used judicially depending on the how desperate the situation is. Now about rooming in and breastfeeding. Worldwide, now the consensus is that the babies should be kept with their mothers and they should be receiving the mother's feed. Whether they are the WHO guidelines or whether the guidelines from the Royal College from UK, they have been recommending that babies should be in rooming in with the mothers and they should be given direct mother's feed. Initially, American Academy of Pediatrics and CDC were of the opinion that the babies should be separated and they should be given express breast milk. But over the last few months, their attitude has also changed and they also recommend a shared decision-making with the parents, and they recommend now that the babies should receive the mother's feed. So there is no evidence of transmission of infection via breast milk as of now. So WHO supports the KMC, the skin-to-skin care of the baby, along with rooming in and breastfeeding. All the Indian regulatory bodies, the IAP, the FOXI, and the NNF, they all are universally recommending rooming in of the baby along with breastfeeding, but they emphasize that there should be strict precautionary measures. Now, some of the patients in the NNF COVID-19 registry, where there was a slight increase in acquiring the COVID-19 infection of the newborns, could be because that the parents were not following the strict precautionary guideline. But the benefits of the rooming in and of the breastfeeding, they far outweigh the risk of transmission of infection from the mother to the baby. We have the second wave on us, although it is petering out right now. But in view of protecting the newborn babies, we must ensure that the minimum number of caregivers handle the baby. There will be universal masking of all the family members and the household contact. Physical distancing, respiratory etiquette, and strict hand hygiene must be followed. And in this second wave, the recommendations are that the mother and the baby should be discharged from the hospital at the earliest, provided they are medically stable. Just a few words about the long-term impact of the neonatal COVID. Although we are not sure what it is going to be, but there are certain conjectures. The infected newborn babies who have no or mild symptoms may remain hypoxic for a variable period of time before they become overtly symptomatic. Now, these newborns go home and they are being handled by the household contacts, by the other caregivers, and especially by the grandparents. In Indian settings, most of the time, the babies are with the grandmothers. Now, these newborns may become silent carriers, leading to prolonged shedding of the virus, which is asymptomatic shedding, and they thus cause significant risk to the caregivers, especially the grandparents. Also, this chronic airway inflammation could result in airway remodeling and thickening, predisposing the baby to develop childhood asthma in the future. The long-term impact of the COVID-19 exposure on the newborn baby could be on the respiratory system, it could be on their cardiovascular system, and it could also lead to neurodevelopment issues. But a far more important thing, to my mind, is the psychosocial impact. And the psychosocial impact is for everyone, not only for the newborn babies. COVID-19 has altered this scenario completely. It has turned our world upside down. And its psychosocial impact on our mindsets, on our thinking, on our priorities is tremendous. We do not realize it to the extent that it will be there. And this alteration in our mindset, I always say that our lives have changed forever. It will never be the same again in the post-COVID era, whether it is the practice of medicine or whether it is our social life in general or our family life in general. So these impacts of the neonatal COVID and pediatric and adult COVID are very far-reaching, and therefore we must also be cognizant of these effects whenever we are tackling the COVID-19 situation. Just a quick summary. Neonatal COVID is not uncommon. Vertical transmission is extremely rare. Intramartum and postnatal transmission is common, but you can prevent it by simple measure. Most of the infected neonates are asymptomatic. The symptoms are quite often related to prematurity and its complication. And this is one confounding factor in evaluating the prognosis of the neonatal COVID. In the second wave, COVID pneumonia is being seen more commonly. And also some patients are being reported of the multisystem inflammatory syndrome in the newborn babies also. The treatment is symptomatic and supportive. The prognosis is uniformly good, but certain patients who develop symptomatic neonatal COVID might land up with a severe problem. And in this situation, you have to be very careful in handling, because more and more cases of MIS-N and MIS-C are being reported now. Babies and older children are having more problems now as compared to a few weeks back. And this is a very dire situation, and we must consider this. Thank you so much for being such a patient audience.
Thank you, Dr. Rakesh. I think it was an excellent presentation, extensively covered on all aspects of perinatal as well as neonatal COVID, ranging from asymptomatic, the transmission, to the MIS-N, which we might expect an increasing numbers in future. And I think one very, very important aspect that you touched was, like, both in Dr. Niranjan's talk as well as in your talk, we have to see that even if the children are, the disease severity in the children is less and the fewer symptomatic children are there, but I think it has got far-reaching consequences on the psyche of the children. It has affected them immensely, because schools have been shut down for almost more than a year. Children have, their outdoor activities have become so restricted. They have so closely observed loss of lives in front of them. So I think even though COVID may not be directly affecting them as disease per se, but the entire scenario has definitely affected them tremendously. I think that's several studies are going on already on that, and I think we will have very, very startling results on that. That's a very, very nice aspect that you touched. I think rest of the things were very well covered. I need not repeat it. You have been very crisp in your summary also. So there are, I will invite both our speakers, Dr. Niranjan as well as Dr. Bhatia. There are several questions in the chat box. I think we will take them one by one. And I also have my questions. If they are not covered, then I will also ask. So in the chat box, the first question is: the person received 2 doses of Covaxin after 21 days and the spike protein antibodies are 0. What to do? I think it was very well explained in the last lecture by Dr. Vipin that, the spike antibodies or spike protein antibodies may not be, the sine qua non of not having antibodies, and there are other factors also which contribute to it. And the second thing about it is that since we are talking about Covaxin, there is always a scope of taking a third dose as well, since it is an inactivated vaccine. So I think these are the two options. If any of the speakers or anybody from the audience wants to add on something on this. Okay, then we can go on to the next question. Can we use NOAC in adolescent patients when anticoagulants are indicated? Dr. Sanjay, would you like
These
to take
are novel oral anticoagulants. These are more tested and they are being given in adults only. So for children, we have limited experience, and for now, they are not right.
Even actually, they are substitutes for warfarin, and the
Yes.
recommendations, and they are more in use for chronic, prevention of chronic thromboembolic phenomena.
Which
So
is more in
for
adults.
acute COVID, yes, for acute COVID, the anticoagulants which are actually recommended are unfractionated heparin or low molecular weight heparin. So I think NOAC does not. I have not read reports about use of NOAC in place of anticoagulants. Again, anybody else has a different viewpoint on the use of NOAC in acute COVID-19?
The full form is novel oral anticoagulant. Actually, NOVAC is also a new term.
Okay, there is a question from Dr. Vineet whether that shock seen in MISC, but nothing about inotropes. So,
actually, shock, yes, very, very good question. Shock is managed like the shock, but in MISC, in COVID, what happens that shock is more commonly cardiogenic rather than septic shock. So, when we have to be careful in giving bolus doses, so we give bolus doses of crystalline slowly over, say, longer period of time, and then also assess. And we can give higher fluids if hypotension is there. So that way, monitoring is better. And then when we use inotropes, then we use which are more cardiac or oriented cardiac, using cardiogenic shock, like epinephrine and milrinone. These are the better options for cardiogenic shock. Thank you.
Okay, when to give aspirin? Every MIC or Kawasaki-like picture, do we give aspirin for? Is it recommended for any kind of MISC?
Yes.
And how long? How long the aspirin should be given?
This is a difficult question. Actually, in MISC, if it is with severe settings, it is given recommended whenever, but the platelet count should be more than 80,000. And even if it is not with shock, even then it is recommended to be given. And dose is okay, 3 mg per kg, 81 mg per day total maximum dose. But duration, I am not really sure. If somebody else can tell the duration.
It is given for 6 to 8 weeks and can be extended up to 12 weeks.
12 weeks.
I'd like to add something about the MISC. This is the time that we have to be alert to the possibility of MISC. Much more. This is much more serious a problem as compared to the COVID-19 itself. And many more cases are being seen right now as compared to a few weeks back. I've been talking to my friends here and in other cities, and there's been a flurry of cases, many of them presenting with serious cardiac issues, many of them presenting with severe GI problems. And I've been talking to one of the cardiologist friends from Sarganga, Dr. Neeraj, and some of these cases can take a very severe turn very quickly. Dr. Neeraj was talking of a patient whom he examined at 10 o'clock in the morning, who had been brought to him in from the PICU. His ejection fraction was 55 at that time. And after a few hours, he got a call that baby has gone into shock. And he went back, he did a repeat echo, and the ejection fraction has fallen to 35 within a span of a couple of hours. The baby was quickly managed. they were able to manage the baby very quickly because he was in the PICU at Gangaram Hospital. But this indicates that some of these patients can take a very quick, very severe turn and can become very sick right in front of your eyes. So you have to be alert to the possibility of MIC. And now, even in your clinic, one of the clinical clues that has been observed is that if a child with fever presents with a red or a flushed face, think of MISC. Or if he presents with unusually severe GI symptoms, then this must be a marker for suspecting the MISC, because this syndrome can really affect the babies very severely and can sometimes be having fatal consequences.
I think absolutely. And in the coming weeks, since the wave is coming down, and we've seen that the entire family households have been affected. So, you know, we may see it as a repercussion coming in 4 weeks time or so, because that is the time which is preempted to be a risk factor for, you know, a child already having suffered 4 weeks back, and then this symptom as an inflammatory response may be there. And as you rightly said, that there could be...
I recall from Dr. Dhiren's talk on this. He said it is 1 in 1,000 in adults, and it is 20 times less in children. So even if we are seeing the cases, because of the large number of cases affected, the percentage remains the same probably.
Yes, correct. No, what I'm saying is that since we have not seen too many admissions of children in the present wave, but you know, we cannot totally write off from pediatric point of view, because any cases of MISC may be, you know, we may up against them in the coming month. That's what we have to be. We have to keep our level of suspicion very, very high, and specifically considering the fact that, you know, in summers, you do expect so many other tropical infections, which are very, very close mimics to MISC. So, you know, inflammatory markers, as well as, you know, like I said, pro-BNP, ECG, ECO, and, you know, testing for other infections assumes important, especially because the treatment will consist of steroids and IVIG. So that is why it is absolutely important. There is another, you know, in adults also a syndrome of multiple inflammatory syndrome. Adults has also been described, just as in neonates it is described. And this is also, you know, as by definition, it is a condition which occurs in people more than 21 years, and with current or past infection, like we say for children also. And it is characterized by severe dysfunction in one or more of the extrapulmonary organs, rather than restricting itself to pulmonary area, and with elevated inflammatory markers and absence of severe respiratory illness. And there are features of shock. So again, in adults also, such a syndrome does exist, which is diagnosed clinically more often, and use of IVIG and steroids and IL-6 is what is recommended. Okay, another question is, what about CRP, ferritin, and D-dimer in MIS when it reverts? Dr. Rakesh, would you like to take that question? Dr. Sanjay seems to be busy.
All these markers, actually, they have no very clear-cut defined values for the children. We're still all in a fluid state, and therefore, one should not bank upon too much on these markers to define the clinical state. One has to go by the clinical situation of the baby also. But generally speaking, if they are twice that of the reported cutoffs, then in that situation, you can assume that the child has recovered from the inflammation.
D-dimer, I think one important thing about D-dimer is the timing of taking it and the way it is processed, because sometimes, exactly, you know, unrealistically high values may be there. And if in view of the clinical symptoms, if they are not matching, then I think we have to take it with a pinch of salt also. And CRP in children, it doesn't go that high as in adults. Like in adults, we have seen in severe cases going up to 100, 150 also. Whereas in children, it usually stays around 50, you know, even in severe cases.
CRP is one marker which has gained an extreme popularity during the COVID season. It has been used not only for diagnosis, also for monitoring the prognosis and monitoring the progress of the disease in adults as well as in older children.
Okay, there is a question on when to use inaxaprine, at what D-dimer levels, and how often to monitor. Dr. Sanjay, will you take up this?
Enoxaparin, yes, enoxaparin actually is indicated when there is a coronary aneurysm and actually echo findings. Coronary aneurysm, LVF is less than 30%. So, and evidence of thrombosis. Then it is used. So, echocardiography and evidence of thrombosis and enoxaparin. That is what there is in the guideline.
Dr. Rakesh, would you like to add something in this?
I think I highly agree with Dr. Sanjay on that point. RF enoxaparin not too much.
Actually, enoxaparin doesn't have too much of this thing to do with D-dimer levels. In moderate cases of adults as well as in children, enoxaparin has been indicated because it is a low molecular weight heparin only. And in severe cases, just to prevent thromboembolic phenomena, enoxaparin has been again linking it to D-dimer levels, though high D-dimer levels always indicate a propensity towards thromboembolism, but it does not have an absolute correlation with the levels. And in all severe cases as well as in moderate cases, the enoxaparin has been recommended.
It is also related to how bad is the aneurysm, how big is the aneurysm. They have some scoring for aneurysm, 2.5, more than 10, like this. Okay. Go ahead, Dr. Alika.
A word about cocktail monoclonal antibodies, which are recently available in India. If given early in the disease to adolescents or adult, do they prevent occurrence of severe disease?
Yes, in children more than 12, they are being tried in the initial phase because this is again antiviral action, so viremia phase, first 10 days.
So some of the adults have been very successful. Some of the adults have been very successful in mitigating the severity of the disease.
Yes, actually, in the Indian guidelines, we still do not have definite indications or use of monoclonal antibodies. But in the NIH guidelines, in the moderate category and in the mild categories, which is progressing towards moderate category, they have found use of monoclonal antibodies. I don't know about the cocktail monoclonal, but it definitely.
This cocktail has recently come by Cipla. So this is the product insert information which I was telling.
So
Donald Trump received the cocktail and on a fairly high dose, and it said that he could manage to escape the severity of the disease because of that. He received the
NIH guidelines strongly recommend the use of monoclonal antibodies, especially in the late mild disease or in moderate, to prevent the progression to the severe disease.
Yes,
but firstly, in adolescents, it has been you can say that we can use it, but in adults, definitely it has been recommended. But not in the Indian guidelines. The Government of India guidelines has not put any word in the severe category. The monoclonal antibodies have been put only as experimental or out of label therapies. Opinion on COVID vaccination in last trimester, the IgG antibodies will cross the placenta and may be protective.
There's the consensus now that all the pregnant and the lactating mothers can receive COVID vaccine. This has been endorsed by the IAP also in the current position paper and also the other regulatory bodies. There is a slight hitch about this, that the antibodies might pass on to the newborn baby and might sometime cause the multisystem inflammatory syndrome. But considering the risk to the benefit ratio, there's a universal recommendation that all pregnant mother, but after discussion on a case-to-case basis, should be offered the vaccine and also the lactating mothers. So there are no confusion in that point, that everyone should get it, just as all other non-pregnant women and non-lactating women.
But there is a contraindication in the first trimester. First trimester mothers should not receive the vaccine.
Yes.
Because of
the
severe
trimester, yes, they should.
Why 2 persons technique in bag and mask? A question from Dr. Vineet.
See, with one person doing both the things, it is the seal of the mask is not really very good. So when one person is holding the mask and also the mandible, so this way he can ensure a tight seal of the mask on the baby's face or the child's face. And in this situation, the other person does the bagging. So although the number of person increases, but the bag and mask efficiency goes up. So this is why the recommendation for the 2% technique for the bag and mask ventilation.
So this is for COVID or non-COVID otherwise?
Even for otherwise, even for the non-COVID.
Please indicate the use of steroids in terms of preference of steroid indication and duration. Dr. Sanjay.
So usually in moderate disease, dexamethasone 0.15 mg per kg twice daily is given, and after 5 days it can be tapered to oral if the response is there. But in severe cases, when IVIG is costly, then methylprednisolone is given intravenously now. Then it is further tapered and given orally and then tapered off.
Actually, both can be given. The dexamethasone also can be given and methylprednisolone can also be given. But considering the cost and availability, I think dexamethasone is more widely used. The only thing in children is that they should not go home on steroids. That is what the recommendation is, that you should not send the child on steroids. The child should remain admitted till he, you start tapering it. Okay.
Hyperglycemia is fairly common. Hyperglycemia is extremely common in those who've been receiving steroids, children as well as adults. That's a very confounding factor.
Way to keep the baby of COVID mother admitted for reasons like prematurity.
I don't get you.
Signs and symptoms of COVID.
I don't get the question.
The question is where to keep the baby of COVID mother admitted for reason like prematurity, not without any signs and symptoms of COVID. So if the mother has born a premature baby, where should you keep the baby?
Like I said in the slides, it depends on the gestational age of the baby. If the baby's gestational age is less than 34 weeks, or if the baby is sick, then he has to be kept in the NICU, in the COVID suspect area or in the COVID confirmed area. But if the baby is otherwise all right, and his gestational age more than 34 weeks, and if the mother is quite well, he can be kept with the mother. But if the mother is sick, then he can be kept in a well baby COVID ward, where he can be given the formula or the EPM. So it depends on the status of the mother as well as the baby. If the baby is sick, he goes into the NICU. If the mother is sick, he goes into the well baby ward. So sickness of the baby and the mother's status, both of these will be important in taking that decision.
Okay, recently there were some guidelines that kangaroo mother care can be feasible.
Yes, WHO is very strongly recommending the KMC. The baby should be offered KMC and the baby should be roomed